Welcome back, everybody. It's me, guy who uses Call of Duty gameplay as his background. But today we're going to be looking at Richard Feynman. Now, you're probably wondering, who is Richard Feynman? Well, Richard Feynman was a theoretical physicist. Now, you're probably also wondering, what is theoretical physics? Now, I'm going to tell you something, and this is probably going to make your brain explode. But theoretical physics is a branch of physics that employs mathematical models and abstractions of physical objects in systems to rationalize, explain, and predict natural phenomena. Now, you're probably wondering what that is, and that's basically a field of science that's used to kind of try to explain how the world works. And it can be pretty confusing. So great, he was a theoretical physicist, but is he significant to history? Well, let's take a look. So he was born in 1918 to his father Melville and Lucille. His father had an unsatisfied dream of becoming a scientist himself, and when Feynman was born, he kind of impressed this dream onto him, but it was never a narrow path for him, like, you will be such and such instead of, you will be such and such. Instead, his approach was more intuitive and subtle. So Feynman's father, Melville, worked as a uniform maker, and so with this job, he develops a kind of hatred towards authority, in which that he would later pass on to his son. So one day, his father, Melville, shows him a picture in the New York Times of a general standing in New York while everyone's saluting him. And he tells his son Richard, "You see this man? You see him? You see him? You see this guy right here? You see how everyone's saluting him? They're only saluting him because of his rank, not because of something he necessarily did." Feynman in his youth years developed a kind of interest in the way the world works. His father and him would read books about dinosaurs, and he was always fascinated with the dinosaurs. And then one day Feynman constructed his own laboratory inside the house, and he would ask his sister to come in and do these experiments with him, in which his sister would kind of be, I guess, the guinea pig figure. Like, she would be the one, like, getting shocked by electricity so he could amuse his friends. So one day, Feynman wins a math competition at his high school, which allows him to get a place at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or, for short, MIT. But there, he kind of, like, developed his character of kind of like the guy who isn't really necessarily, like, sure, he's really brilliant, but he doesn't always need to act like it, I guess you could say that. Because at one point at MIT, there was a guy in the dormitory who constantly was complaining about people not shutting his door. So Feynman one day heard the guy telling one of his friends to shut the door. So Feynman decided that he was going to pull a prank on this guy. So when everyone was gone out of the dormitory during school one day, he decided to take a screwdriver and take the door off its hinges and hide it in the basement. You can kind of imagine how the guy felt when he found out that there was no longer a door for anybody to shut. So the guy went on a rampage, interrogating everybody that he could, until Feynman eventually confessed. But the point is, nobody really believed Feynman did it. And so the interrogations went on, and Feynman eventually had to prove that he actually did steal the door by going down into the basement and bringing it back up. After his years at MIT, he went on to Princeton as a graduate student, where he later discovered that his girlfriend that he left behind, Arlene Greenbaum, now has tuberculosis. Yeah, that thing that everybody did not like back then. So there was no cure or anything. So back then, tuberculosis was a terminal illness, so she only had a select few years to live. So that's when he decided that he was going to marry her, and they were going to spend what little time they had left. Decided that they were going to spend what little time they had left with one another. Wait for it. 1, 2, 3, and boom. Okay, so now we're in World War II. By that point, it had been known for some time by scientists that there is a tremendous amount of energy trapped in the nucleus of every atom, just waiting to be put to work. In particular, it was estimated that at the very least, extremely powerful explosives could be made from this principle. And work was being done in this direction in both Nazi Germany and in the US. And Richard Feynman, still at Princeton, had earned a bit of a reputation for himself among his peers about his exceptional talents in math and physics. And the physicist Robert Wilson gently prodded him to join what was considered one of the most vital wartime projects of all time. time. At first, Feynman's reaction was that this wasn't the sort of thing he would be interested in. It was like, nah. But the thought kind of nagged at him that the Nazis might create their own nuclear device and use it to disastrous ends. So he took the job, moving himself to Los Alamos and his bedridden Arlene to the hospital. So during the week, he worked on the bomb theory, and the weekends, he made his way to the hospital to be with Arlene. And during the weeks, he also got quite bored, so he decided to take up safecracking, which all of his colleagues kind of hated. But you know what? It's whatever keeps you busy, right? The various documents generated by the bomb work were being kept in filing cabinets and combination safes, and there was an unspoken fear as to the safety of these sensitive and dangerous secrets. So Feynman decided, hey, I'm going to break into these safes. Feynman was certain that these measures were far from adequate to safeguard the bomb from the wrong hands, and he set out to demonstrate this by becoming an expert safecracker. Because that's how you prove people wrong in the 1940s. Just outlearn them. Reading books by pros and developing his own methods, he eventually became notorious for his ability to open safes. For example, just after the close of the war, he broke into a bank of files which contained every document for the construction of the bomb, thus showing conspicuously the edge on which our civilization sometimes teeters. Although Feynman's time in New Mexico wasn't all fun, in the months just near the end of the war, Arlene's tuberculosis worsened, and in July 1945, just before the very first test of the bomb, she passed away due to her illness. Richard was fortunate enough to at least be by her side during that moment. Afterwards, he made his way back to Los Alamos and put it out of his mind by further immersing himself into his work. The bomb was soon finished, and he was privileged to witness the detonation of the world's first nuclear bomb. During the Trinity test, the scientists were each given goggles to look at the bomb. The goggles were tinted so as the blast wouldn't blind them. Feynman thought this was ridiculous, of course, and so to prove his theory that the bomb wouldn't be that bright, that the only harmful effects coming off the bomb would be ultraviolet radiation waves, which you could easily shield yourself from by simply hiding behind glass. He got inside a nearby truck before the test of the bomb, and looked out the window and waiting for the detonation. He later recalled it being the dumbest mistake he ever made in his entire life. As short as the second the bomb went off, he immediately got a taste of what a nuclear explosion looks like. After the end of World War II, Feynman suffered a bit of a depression after. Put simply, the main factors of his depression were the death of his wife Arlene, the death of his father Melville, and the fact that the very thing that he just made had been used to kill hundreds of thousands of people. So after that, he made a personal vow to himself to never again involve himself in the affairs of Washington ever again. After the conclusion of the war, Feynman moved on and accepted a professorship with Cornell University. Then in the 1960s, he happened to be at a professional conference in Europe and became acquainted with a charming lady by the name of Gwyneth Howarth, a native of Great Britain. And he'd been in need of someone to fill his loneliness after Arlene's death, and after having surveyed the field extensively, he became certain that Gwyneth would be the one for him. She was patient with his eccentricities, yet shared much of his taste for adventure. And then shortly after that, Feynman moved to California to work at the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, if you like. Although physics wasn't his only interest, he also enjoyed playing bongos. People often joked about Feynman being the guy while other physicists were sitting in fancy clubs talking about science. He was out playing bongos with stoners. He also had a heart for painting. In fact, he became acquainted with this one painter who he made a deal with. Every other Sunday, he would teach Feynman how to paint, and the next Sunday, Feynman would teach him Feynman would teach him physics. Feynman actually got pretty good at art. Feynman would later go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics, which is basically the Oscars for scientists. Feynman actually rejected the prize because he didn't really actually want the prize. In his mind, the adventure itself was the prize. In the end, he split the prize with 3 other scientists. Fast forward a bit, now we're in the 80s. And space is going pretty good, I guess. So now we got this incredibly new thing called the space shuttle, and it's really, really cool, and everybody thinks that it's great. And so people decided that they're going to send a teacher up there and teach from space. Except one little problem. The Challenger kind of exploded.
Off of the 25th space shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range.
So the 25th space shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Looks like a couple of the solid rocket boosters blew away from the side of the shuttle in an explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
And so in the aftermath of the Challenger explosion, then President Reagan ordered an investigation into the matter, and thus the Rogers Commission was formed. Although most of the people in the Rogers Commission were actually Washington bureaucrats, and they needed an actual scientist in on it. So they asked Richard Feynman, although this completely goes against his oath to himself of never getting involved in Washington ever again, although curiosity did kill the cat, and that's what got him to join. Feynman would later find out that NASA had actually had not been telling him the whole truth about the matter, and he later discovered that the problem with the rocket, and that executives at NASA actually knew that there was a risk of launching it the day that they did, because the day that they launched it, it was really cold, and there's these things on the side of the rockets called rubber O-rings, and when it's colder, they lose their elasticity and snap. So despite the requests of the rocket engineers, NASA executives decided to launch the rocket anyway. The result of which was catastrophic for the rocket and those inside. But Feynman needed a way to prove this so that it could not have been disproven. Or what better way to do that than on live national television?
I took the stuff that I got out of your seal and I put it in ice water. And I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it doesn't stretch back, it stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees. I believe that has some significance for our problem.
After this last safe, Feynman had truly had enough. Feynman had earlier discovered that he had a rare type of cancer in his kidneys called liposarcoma. This was probably because of his constant exposure to radiation during the Manhattan Project. And of course, he underwent a surgery to try and take care of it, but it did no good. And on February 15th, 1988, Feynman passed away. Richard Feynman is, in my opinion, one of the single most interesting people in U.S. history, and had one of the most interesting lives of all time. Going from a laboratory in his basement to stealing doors at MIT to stealing top secret files from the Manhattan Project to rejecting a Nobel Prize and to solving the Challenger space shuttle disaster. that the only words that can describe this man are a curious character.
Exploring. We're trying to find out as much as we can about the world. People say to me, are you looking for the ultimate laws of physics? No, I'm not. I'm just looking to find out more about the world. And if it turns out there is a simple ultimate law that explains everything, so be it. That would be very nice to discover. If it turns out it's like an onion with millions of layers and we're just sick and tired of looking at the layers, then that's the way it is. But whatever way it comes out, its nature is there, and she's going to come out the way she is. And therefore, when we go to investigate it, we shouldn't pre-decide what it is we're trying to do, except to find out more about it.